The greatest investment lesson of my life was not how to read a balance sheet. It was not how to calculate intrinsic value. It was not even how to spot a great manager. It was learning very early that most businesses are mortal. They look permanent when you are standing inside their best years. They feel unbeatable when they dominate your town, your country, or your imagination. Then the world shifts. The economics weaken. The moat turns out to be shallower than it looked. And what once seemed like a fortress becomes a memory with a logo. If you live long enough, you see this again and again. The market does not run out of famous names. It runs out of durable ones. That is why I stopped asking the most popular question in business, which is what is growing fastest right now. I started asking a harder question: what still deserves to exist 20 years from now? That is a very different standard. A business can grow quickly because conditions are flattering it. A business can report wonderful margins because competitors have not arrived yet. A business can feel modern, urgent, celebrated, and still be only a temporary arrangement between fashion and capital. I have no particular interest in owning temporary arrangements at a permanent price. I want businesses' time helps. That is one of the deepest differences between speculation and investing. Speculation asks what people will admire next. Investing asks what reality will still need after admiration has moved on. The reason this matters is simple. Time is the great amplifier in finance. If time works against you, even a bright beginning may end in disappointment. If time works for you, an apparently boring business can become one of the most valuable things you will ever own. That is why I have spent so much of my life hunting, not for excitement, but for endurance. People hear that and assume endurance means dullness. They are wrong. Endurance is one of the most beautiful economic qualities in the world. It means the business does not have to win a new war every morning just to keep yesterday's profits. It means the customer comes back. It means the asset base gets harder to replace, not easier. It means the company earns more because it has been around, not less. It means the future is not a fresh referendum on whether the enterprise deserves to live. That sort of business is rare. Much rarer than most people think. I learned that lesson before I understood the words economists use to describe it. I learned it as a boy when I was young in Omaha. I watched retail up close. A grocery shelf can teach you more about capitalism than some business schools do. At that age, I saw merchants who worked hard, opened early, stayed late, worried constantly, and still lost. That made a deep impression on me. I saw people who thought they understood their trade get crushed, not because they were lazy or foolish, but because the structure of the business gave them no protection. They had customers, inventory, labor, rent, and effort. What they did not have was a moat. That word has become popular. Now, when Charlie and I used it, we were not trying to sound poetic. We were trying to be exact. A moat is what protects the economics of a business from the natural brutality of competition. Without a moat, everything you earn is under assault. Without a moat, you are standing in the open field. Someone can underprice you, someone can copy you, someone can outspend you, someone can temporarily work for less. Someone can promise the same thing in brighter packaging. You wake up every day with no real shelter between your profit and the world's hunger for it. That is a bad place to build long-term wealth. I remember very clearly the feeling of watching a small operator study prices in another man's store. Even as a boy, I could sense something humiliating in that scene. A man who had spent years inside his own business was now being forced into the position of a weak observer in someone else's moatless war. He was not losing to one particular villain. He was losing to the nature of his own industry. That distinction mattered to me. A lot of people think failure comes because they chose the wrong competitor. More often it comes because they chose the wrong economic game. A business can be honest, hardworking, beloved, and still structurally weak. The market does not award prizes for effort. It awards long-term wealth to economic position. That is why I became much more interested in industries where the moat does not come and go with fashion. I started to see that a handful of industries keep returning across decades. Not because they are trendy, but because they are built on permanent human realities. Human beings fear uncertainty. They crave certainty, they need movement, energy, and essential systems, and they are drawn to institutions they believe will not cheat them. If you can locate businesses sitting on top of those durable human tendencies, you no longer have to guess so much about whether demand will still exist when the calendar turns. That is one of the great advantages in investing. You stop betting on novelty and start owning permanence. I eventually came to think about a few industries not as business categories, but as expressions of deep human facts. One is built on fear. One is built on certainty. One is built on movement. One is built on necessity. One is built on trust. When you see them that way, the whole subject becomes much clearer. Take insurance. Most people misunderstand insurance because they think the product is a policy. The policy is only the wrapper. The real business is human fear translated. As long as people are mortal, vulnerable, and uncertain, insurance will exist. As long as homes burn, cars crash, people get sick. Lives end unexpectedly, businesses face liability, and property can be damaged. Somebody will want to move that risk somewhere else. That is the starting point. But the truly intelligent insurance operation does something even better than selling peace of mind. It gets paid before the cost of that peace is fully known. That is what float is. And float is one of the most beautiful things in business when it is handled by people with discipline. A customer pays you now. The claim may be paid years later. The money sits with you. If you are foolish, you waste that advantage by underpricing risk, writing bad business, and pretending growth is more important than underwriting sanity. Many insurers do exactly that. They race for market share, they loosen standards, and they convince themselves volume is strength. It is not strength if the economics are rotten. I have always believed the first rule in insurance is not to do dumb business. A disciplined insurer would rather write less business than write unprofitable business. That sounds obvious. It is astonishing how rare it is. What made companies like Geico so interesting to me was not merely that they sold insurance. It was that they combined underwriting discipline with structural advantage. When an insurer prices intelligently, attracts the right risk pool, and keeps expenses low, float becomes an extraordinary engine. It is like being handed enormous sums of investable capital by the public, not as a gift, but as a consequence of serving a permanent human need better than the average competitor. That is not a cyclical trick. That is a durable economic machine over very long periods. That machine can produce wealth in a way that feels almost unfair to people who never bothered to understand it. The public likes glamour. I like businesses where the arithmetic quietly improves while the public is looking elsewhere. Insurance belongs in that category, and its durability has very little to do with whether analysts find it exciting. People did not stop fearing loss in the last century. They will not stop in the next one. That is why the industry endures. Now move from fear to certainty. Branded consumer products look almost trivial to people who have not thought deeply enough. A drink is a drink. Candy is candy. Soap is soap. That is what shallow analysis sounds like. Deep analysis asks a more important question. What does the customer know before he buys? A powerful brand is not just awareness. It is compressed decision making. The buyer does not have to conduct a trial every time. He does not have to investigate quality. He does not have to wonder whether the choice will embarrass him. He knows. That knowing has extraordinary economic value. People often underestimate how much money is made by removing friction from human decisions. A strong brand removes friction. It also does something more subtle. It offers certainty in situations where the buyer does not want to think too hard. A man buying a box of chocolates for someone he loves is not buying sugar alone. He is buying the confidence that the gesture will land well. A person reaching for a familiar beverage is not always buying liquid. Very often he is buying familiarity, emotional consistency, and the absence of risk. That is why Charlie was so right about See's candies, and why I was lucky enough to listen. See's looked too expensive to me at first, in the narrow balance sheet sense. The hard assets were modest, the factories were not some gigantic industrial empire. But the business had something the accounting statement could not fully capture. People on the West Coast knew what that little blue and white box meant. It meant the gift would work. It meant the recipient would smile. That sort of knowledge sitting in the customer's mind is far more valuable than many tangible assets, because when people trust a brand that way, they do not force the company to fight on price every day. That changes everything. Once you have pricing power, time stops being a neutral factor. Time becomes a friend. You can raise prices a little. You can keep the volume. You can generate more cash without rebuilding the whole kingdom every year. That is a wonderful business. The same logic explains why I admired Coca-Cola so much. People did not merely recognize the name. They recognized the experience in advance. That is what a real brand does. It occupies a mental position no latecomer can easily purchase. If I gave someone an enormous sum of money and told him to recreate Coca-Cola's position in the minds of consumers around the globe, he could not do it quickly, perhaps not at all. The brand is not a line item. It is a moat built over decades, sometimes over a century, through repetition, trust, association, and habit. That is why branded consumer products endure. Not because consumers are stupid, because consumers are busy, emotional, habitual, and often eager to reduce decision costs. A trusted brand serves that need beautifully. It is certainty in a package. Now let us move from certainty to movement. A society that functions must move things. Raw materials must move. Grain must move. Cars, lumber, chemicals, containers, fuel, machinery, food, and finished goods must move. For a very long time, people have enjoyed announcing that old transportation systems are obsolete. They often say that when they are standing on top of infrastructure, they do not understand. Railroads are a good example. A railroad is not exciting in the way a new device is exciting. It does not fit the modern appetite for novelty. Good novelty attracts too much careless capital. What matters is the economic role. A railroad owns irreplaceable pathways. It moves enormous weight over long distances with extraordinary fuel efficiency. Its network took generations to build. Its rights-of-way are not something a new entrant casually recreates, because a consultant made a presentation. This is the kind of asset I love. The world can become more digital and still remain physical. That is what investors forget. People talk as though software abolishes steel, grain, concrete, chemicals, and freight. It does not. The digital layer sits on top of a physical world that continues to require movement. And when you own a network essential to that movement, you own something the future still has to pass through. That is not a slogan. It is a moat with rails. When Berkshire bought BNSF, many people thought we were buying nostalgia. They were wrong. We were buying a strategic system. We were buying an asset base that would be prohibitively expensive to replicate and impossible to ignore if you actually cared about how the American economy moves. That matters. If a business occupies a position in the chain of commerce that people cannot easily route around, then it has a kind of endurance that most fashionable companies would envy if they understood it. Infrastructure is full of that sort of endurance. Pipelines, transmission networks, regulated asset grids, freight rails, port switching systems, and other connective tissue of the economy often look boring precisely because they are so embedded. People notice novelty. They lean on infrastructure every day without applause. I like that very much. The less applause required, the better the odds that capital has not already bid the thing into ridiculous territory. Now, let me move from movement to necessity. Utilities are one of the clearest examples of a truth most people resist. Competition is not always the best business model for the owner of capital. This sounds politically impolite. It is still true. The public often talks as though every good business should be built in a gladiator arena where dozens of competitors slash one another for market share. That environment is often dreadful for shareholders. It is wonderful for customers in some cases, but not wonderful for long-term owners. Utilities are different. If a region needs electricity, water, or gas, it does not need 6 overlapping grids fighting each other in the streets. It needs a system that works. The economics of building and maintaining that system naturally favor concentrated ownership and regulated return. To some people, regulation sounds like a burden. To me, in the right context, it often sounds like protection. A regulated utility with a sensible jurisdiction, a necessary asset base, and disciplined capital spending can produce a very attractive long-term proposition. Why? Because the need does not vanish. The service is essential. The asset network is difficult to duplicate, and the allowed return, though it may not be dramatic, often arrives with a steadiness many glamorous businesses cannot dream of. There is enormous value in steady necessity. People may postpone a luxury purchase. They do not decide one evening that electricity is out of fashion. A civilization cannot function without utilities. That simple fact is worth more than a room full of excitement. Utilities also teach an important investing lesson. A business does not need dazzling margins to be wonderful. It needs durability, intelligent capital allocation, and a structure that allows a reasonable return on large, enduring assets. That is enough. In fact, enough is often much better than brilliant-looking economics that invite relentless attack. If a utility earns a fair return year after year while reinvesting in infrastructure that deepens its position, the compounding can be magnificent. Not because it is thrilling, because it is unavoidable. The last category I think about is trust in retail form. This one fascinates me because it reveals how powerful it is when a company persuades the customer that the company is on his side. That is what Costco did so brilliantly. People often think Costco sells bulk merchandise. That is not the real business. Costco sells trust at scale. The membership fee is the key to understanding it. A person pays before he shops. That changes the economic relationship. The company no longer needs to squeeze every last penny from each basket to make the model work. It can keep margins remarkably low, turn the low margins into trust, turn trust into renewal, and turn renewal into a durable customer relationship that competitors have a very hard time matching. A great many businesses say they value the customer. Costco built a system where the customer could feel over and over that the company was not trying to take the extra bite. That is rare. Trust is one of the strongest moats in the world because it compounds in the customer's mind. Once people stop needing to compare every item, a huge amount of friction disappears. The trip becomes easier. The decision becomes easier. The relationship becomes stickier. That is not a small thing. In a world where so many companies nibble constantly at the consumer, a business that becomes known for disciplined fairness can become nearly irreplaceable. That is what membership retail at its best really is. It is not just a store. It is a trusted institution with a self-reinforcing cycle. Low margins create trust. Trust creates renewal. Renewal creates scale. Scale improves purchasing power. Purchasing power supports low margins. The loop strengthens itself. That is a moat built from discipline. And discipline, once embedded in a business culture, can be every bit as valuable as a patent or a trademark. Now, if you step back, what do these categories really have in common? Insurance, branded consumer products, infrastructure, utilities, membership retail. At first glance, they seem very different. One deals with risk, another with candy or beverages, another with freight or rails, another with electric grids, another with warehouses and memberships. But the economic secret is remarkably similar. Each one sits on top of something in human life that changes much more slowly than the market's excitement cycle. Fear changes slowly. The need for certainty changes slowly. The need to move goods changes slowly. The need for essential services changes slowly. The value of trust changes slowly. That is the whole point. If you invest in industries built on permanent human tendencies, you no longer require you require it only to remain human. That is a much safer bet. I want to say something else that often gets lost when people talk about timeless industries. Timeless does not mean effortless. There are bad insurance companies. There are weak brands. There are utility managers who allocate capital foolishly. There are infrastructure assets bought at absurd prices. There are retailers that destroy trust by getting greedy. The industry is not a magic wand. It is a favorable terrain. You still need discipline. You still need price sensitivity. You still need management that understands what the moat actually is and does not casually destroy it for quarterly applause. This is where many people make the second great mistake. They learn that a durable industry matters and then conclude that any company in that industry deserves any price. That is nonsense. A moat is not a permission slip for stupidity. It is an invitation to think more clearly. I would much rather pay a sensible price for a durable business than an absurd price for a fashionable one. But I still care deeply about the price. That is one reason patience matters so much. When you know what kind of business you want, you can afford to wait. You do not need to buy every shiny thing merely because it exists. The world will always offer you more excitement than you need and fewer true moats than the newspapers imply. That is fine. A small handful is enough. It has always amused me how often people assume investing success comes from knowing many things. I have not found that to be the decisive factor. The decisive factor is often knowing a few very important things deeply and then not losing your mind. Know what kind of business truly endures. Know what kind of economics invite durability. Know where time deepens the moat rather than eroding it. Know how to value that business with some margin of safety. Then, once you have found it, be patient enough to let the economics do the work. That is more than enough. Most people fail on the last step. They find a good thing and then become bored or frightened or greedy or eager to prove they are active. Activity is overrated. A great many fortunes were not made by constant brilliance. They were made by a few good decisions held through long periods of ordinary temptation. That is a much less exciting sentence than the public prefers. It is also a much truer one. One of the most underrated qualities in investing is the ability to sit still when you already own something excellent. This is much harder than it sounds because good assets get interrupted by bad moods. The market gets nervous. The economy weakens. A scandal appears. A temporary earnings dip arrives. A macro scare causes everyone to speak in apocalyptic language. In those moments, people forget what they own. They start responding to weather rather than to structure. That is expensive. If you own a genuinely enduring business in a genuinely durable industry with an honest moat, you must give time a chance to help you. Time cannot help if you keep selling every time the sky gets gray. That is why I have often said my favorite holding period is forever. People quote that as though it were a slogan. It is not a slogan. It is a statement about the type of economic asset I prefer. If the moat deepens, if the need persists, if the company allocates capital intelligently, if the business throws off cash and preserves trust, then why should I want to interrupt the compounding just to satisfy some craving for movement? Movement is not the same thing as progress. This becomes more obvious the older you get. I am old enough now to know that fashion is a terrible guide for permanent capital. Fashion tells you where attention is. Moats tell you where economics are. Attention moves fast. Economics often move very slowly. That is why great fortunes often belong to people who looked a little dull in the middle. They were not dull. They were loyal to the right things, and loyalty to the right thing, expressed through time, is one of the most profitable behaviors in the world. If I had to condense my whole philosophy into something any ordinary person could use, it would sound almost disappointingly plain. Do not chase what can be copied easily. Do not confuse effort with protection. Do not confuse a current margin with a durable moat. Do not let the crowd teach you to worship excitement. Look for businesses built on permanent human needs. Look for economics that get stronger with time rather than weaker. Look for management that protects the moat instead of renting it out for a temporary headline. Then, once you find it, have the discipline to sit there and let the years do what they do. That is all. It is not mystical. It is not glamorous. It is simply much harder than it sounds because human beings are not naturally built to admire stillness. They like stories, they like novelty, they like motion. The market will happily sell them all three. The market pays much better for patience attached to the right business. That is the bargain I chose a long time ago, and if I were speaking to someone much younger today, I would tell him to learn this lesson earlier than I did. Do not ask first which company is hottest. Ask which industry deserves to exist after the hot companies have come and gone. Do not ask first whether the product is exciting. Ask whether the economics are protected. Do not ask first how fast a stock can double. Ask whether time itself will keep deepening the moat. That is the kind of thinking that survives. The rest is noise with a ticker symbol. When people ask me what sort of industries can still be trusted 20 years from now, I do not reach for what sounds futuristic. I reach for what sits closest to permanent human behavior and permanent economic need. Fear will remain. So insurance will remain. The desire for certainty will remain. So trusted brands will remain. The need to move goods and transmit value through real systems will remain. So infrastructure will remain. The need for power, water, and essential services will remain. So utilities will remain. And the public desire to shop, where trust is embedded in the model rather than merely advertised, will remain. So great membership retail will remain. That is enough for me. It has been enough for a very long time. I do not need the whole world. I need a few places where the economics are durable, the moat is real, and time behaves like an ally. Find enough of those, and life gets much simpler. Not easy. Simpler. You stop running after every idea. You stop envying every fast mover. You stop feeling obligated to understand every fashionable corner of the market. You begin respecting your own circle. You begin admiring endurance. You begin appreciating just how much wealth can accumulate when the business does not keep asking you to rescue it. That is the kind of wealth I have always preferred. Not the kind that needs a new miracle every quarter. The kind that sits there, serves real human needs, and gets stronger because the years pass, not weaker. If you can learn to love that sort of business, and learn to wait without becoming restless, the world can become extraordinarily generous to you. Not instantly, not theatrically, quietly. Then massively enough that people looking from the outside call it luck. It was never luck. It was a moat, a sound price, and time. That is all I ever really trusted. It is still all I trust now.